All right, back again. Hi guys. Probably been wondering where I've been lately. The answer's not that exciting. College. You know how it is. I mentioned it in the last video, but this series was a gift for a friend who ended up pursuing other ventures really soon after I posted the first piece, and I only had 14 subscribers back then, so I logged out of this account and genuinely forgot about it. I didn't even think about this series until I graduated in June, and I was completely stunned at the response. But it has led me here to buying a nicer microphone and finishing what we started. So welcome back. I hope you guys are excited. I do have a few things I wanted to correct from the first video. In the first video, I said that making a visual novel is easy. I really should have used the word simple. As you'll see, it's a straightforward process, but it's very time-consuming. So simple is probably a better word for what we're doing. So today, we are going to be going over the mood boards for each individual character that you guys will have the option to date in the final game. We will talk a little bit about each backstory, and we are going to actually be looking at a process video I made of character sprites for one of our main characters. If you're looking to make a dating sim, you're probably looking to make some pretty likable characters, and different people seek out different things, so I can't really tell you the right way to make a character for a dating sim, but there are some things that I think are important to consider when you're designing characters. The first is going to be the intended rating of your game. The age of your audience is obviously going to affect the behavior of your characters. Their actions or even just their personalities might be determined in part or in full by the rating that you're going for. Tropes. A lot of people like to use tropes when it comes to making characters because those types of characters are popular or they make for interesting narrative opportunities. The concern with using tropes is that you want to make sure that you are not edging into stereotyping territory. Tropes exist for a reason and are useful, but stereotypes aren't always very kind, right? Limitations of your media. There are some things that are just better suited for other mediums. Extended action sequences is a really good example of something that can be very difficult to do in a visual novel. You also just have to think about the skills of your artist or writer. Can the skills of your writer match the skills of your artist? Vice versa. There might be some things that your artist wants to do that your writer can't logically make happen, or there might be some things that your writer wants that the artist isn't sure how to draw. If you're making this as a single person like I am, you know those limits better than you would if you were working with a team, but it is still something to consider. And the social aspect. Dating sims fulfill a human desire for quality time, so as a game creator, we sort of have a social responsibility to not make shitty characters. How are our characters making the most quality out of the time that they have with our players? But let's move on and meet the mood boards for our characters. So, as I mentioned in the first video, this is going to be set in like a proto-Byzantine, early medieval kingdom. So obviously you have to have a king. As you can see from the mood board, we're looking for somebody who's a little bit older, maybe a little bit rough around the edges. He's kind of been through a lot, but he's still very pretty, of course. You can't have a visual novel without the evil character, right? So we have our administrator. She is the girl who can make him worse. She's terrible, she's awful, and she is so much fun. We have our childhood best friend character, so fulfilling one of those tropes that I mentioned earlier. This character is going to be a knight, and she's going to be the character that is known the player character the longest. We are going to have the Oracle. The Oracle obviously is somebody who sees into the future, and they are going to be sort of the mystical aspect of this game. The artist, the divine artist, so this is going to be a character who translates what the Oracle sees in their visions into artwork that can be shared with the rest of the kingdom. And he's a little bit crazy because of this. He's trying to interpret visions that nobody knows. And last, but certainly not least, we have our divine champion. This man cannot read. This man barely knows what numbers are. He knows how to hug his friends, and that's about it. So now that we have the idea for who our characters are going to be, we have to get a sense for what they're going to look like. Like I said, I'm not really going to teach you guys how to draw. I will be sharing my drawing process later, but one of the things I recommend before doing any kind of character art is doing a couple of life drawing studies. This one is a 3-minute, this one is, I believe, a 5-minute, and this one is a 20 and a 45. So I'd recommend, going online, finding a couple of decent reference images, and just drawing a couple of humans before you get started. Get used to the shape language of the human body. Having an understanding of what people look like in the real world is incredibly useful when it comes to translating that into attractive dating sim characters. So given the descriptions that you guys have already had, let's go ahead and meet our cast. Obviously, without any clothing or, accessories or anything to imply it, it might be kind of hard to tell which character is supposed to fulfill what role, but with their outfits, it should be a lot clearer. I would really like to emphasize the importance of organization in a venture like this. As you can see, this document was made just for myself, and very few of the layers have names, which is a darn shame because there are over 200 layers in this document, and as you can imagine, if I were to try to ship this off to somebody else, say I was a concept artist in a company, and I sent this off to maybe a character modeler, they would open this document and see all of these barely labeled layers, and they would get very mad at me very quickly, and they would be right to. So this is kind of a good example of what not to do, right? All of these layers that are barely labeled or, labeled something stupid. When we look at our king character sprites, you'll see kind of a better way of doing this. So I've thrown around the term character sprites a couple times, and for those who don't know, character sprites are the 2D interchangeable images of characters that the player interacts with. The interchangeability of characters is relative. Like these examples from a different project I've worked on only had 6 expressions. They didn't change hairstyles or clothing, but for the purposes of a dating sim, the more expression options, obviously, the better. And we also can do things like changing up hairstyles, outfits, or even poses. Making character sprites seems kind of daunting at first. How do we make sure that the different sprites look as similar as possible? How can we control the interchangeability of these moving parts? The answer is layers, knowing how to use them and using them in a way that helps us. So let's just jump right into the process using the king for our dating sim as today's subject. So as you can see, I chose not to record the sketching process. I am a very slow sketcher and it takes me an incredibly long time. Not to mention that the footage you're looking at has already been sped up 40 times. I really didn't want to make this any longer than it had to be, so we're just going to forego the sketches for now. If you look, you can already see I was not doing great when it comes to labeling my layers. I get better as I go on and as I get back into the flow. But you will notice that each element that I want to change, so the faces, the hair, and the clothing, they all exist in separate folders on top of the blank body base. Let's talk a little bit about this character himself. He doesn't have a name yet, Little Miss No Name. I'm taking suggestions, I guess, but most of the kings of this era had kind of a naming convention, and I think that, frankly, most of them are just too similar to each other to be particularly interesting. You'll notice as we move on that the king is an amputee. He is missing his hand, and the scars on his face line up with that same injury. If you do want to do a character that has scars or limb loss or anything like that, I think it's a great idea, and you definitely should. But you'll want to determine how those injuries were received. Even if it never comes up in the plot, you want to know, what caused those injuries or how they were received so that the actual scars on the body make sense. So for our king, and a little bit of his backstory, he lost his hand and received that facial scar. On his wedding night, he happened to marry a young woman from a different kingdom, the princess of a different kingdom, and he thought that the marriage was, you know, a positive political alliance, and it kind of wasn't. It was really a little bit more of a death trap. So he survived, but he didn't make it out in one piece. So you can see it with my line art, I'm just using a lot of the pens that come with Clip Studio Paint. I have a couple custom brushes when it comes to coloring, but I really like the Real G pen option because it feels very similar to Micron pens, which are the thing that I like to use in the real world. You'll notice that there's kind of an awkward cutoff at the bottom of the character. He's sort of right above the knees. The text box is going to hide the bottom couple inches of the illustration. So it's a good idea to draw more than you're willing to show, just so that you have that bleed space, so that when you actually have your character on screen, you can see the most important elements and nothing particularly important is getting cut off. As we get further in here, you can see I'm lining up a lot of things. I have my layers turned on kind of together so that we make sure that different items fit, things like a crown having to fit on top of hairstyles, or just making sure that all of his clothes actually fit on the body that we see. So now we're coming in with the flats, and I did want to say when it comes to the color and clothing and just kind of everything about my color choices, they were mostly arbitrary. However, because he is the king and this is sort of that Proto-Byzantine world, he is going to be wearing primarily purple, but the green is sort of a choice of, you know, maybe it's his favorite color, but I thought it was representative of like nurturing and kindness, and he is a very patient man. He does have a daughter. She is the result of that unfortunate marriage that did end in, you know, a murder attempt. She actually is kind of going to be the catalyst for most of the main events of our game. Not all dating sims have a coherent plot, but I thought it would be kind of interesting to do one for ours. So the main catalyst for this plot is that many years ago, after his failed marriage, he did have a daughter. And for the most part, the different plots that we will kind of experience with each character center around the princess. Concerns about her safety and lineage. It's going to be sort of a political base on which we will build sort of these interpersonal relationships. I did want to say, as you see me coming in with the colors, that asymmetry is, you know, to be expected. Things like reflecting or using symmetry tools in Photoshop, Clip Studio, Procreate, these are all really good tools, but I would recommend that you use them sparingly. Human faces are not perfectly symmetrical, and in fact, if something is too symmetrical, it can kind of fall into that uncanny valley and get a little bit creepy or unnerving. So a little bit of asymmetry is okay, it's normal, and it kind of shows that you, as an artist, care about the world around you, kind of care about what you're looking at. I'm gonna be honest and tell you guys that all of the hairstyle decisions that I made for this game are completely arbitrary because the Byzantine era has some of the most unsexy hair imaginable. We're talking bowl cuts everywhere. So, if you can't be cute, like, why are you in a dating sim? So, no, the hairstyles are not accurate in the least. The clothing, for the most part, the shapes are accurate, but the colors are probably not going to be one-to-one. The only character that really has a lot of historical accuracy in his color palette is the king that we're working on right now. It's a little hard to focus on individual concepts just because we are moving so quickly, thanks to how time-consuming this process can be. So if you have any questions, make sure that you stick around, leave comments for me. I will be streaming the process of making the other character sprites, so if you have a specific question for a specific character, it might be a good idea to hold on, and I'd be happy to answer those things live. As I come in and work on the characters' expressions, you can see it becomes very difficult to keep these wildly different illustrations looking like they're the same person. So here you can see that I have placed the completed expression alongside my working space, just so I can refer back to it and make sure that I am kind of following the same rules that I gave myself when I created that first face. That will help all of them look consistent, feel like they belong to the same character. For me, I find that my expressions don't change the nose very much at all. So for the king and for most of the characters we're going to be working on, I chose to actually leave the nose as part of the body base. That way I just don't have to redraw it, and the less things that you have to redraw, the more consistent the final look will feel. It's all a matter of personal choice, really, but I prefer something that looks as consistent as possible. You'll also notice that some of his expressions have names that are kind of unusual. He does have 11 expressions. We'll probably add more later. Something to keep in mind as you are making, a full panel of characters, more than just one, is that different people are going to express in different ways, and as you're working on your characters, you might find that they don't all express in the same way, that anger looks differently on different characters, and I encourage you to let that happen. People express emotions in different ways, and it makes for interesting and unique characters, and it also kind of follows the things that we expect from the real world. Now, I'm not expecting everybody that is going to make a dating sim to want to be accurate to a time period or even really care about fashion all that much, but you definitely want to think about the color choices that you are making when you are designing your characters. Defining characters by their colors can make them very distinct. If you've never done any research on color theory, now is definitely the time. I'm not saying that you have to be an expert, obviously, but just having a little bit of an understanding of what colors mean what things or what kind of emotions they evoke can be really helpful when it comes to trying to give a passive idea of what your character is all about. When it comes to limb loss or physical differences on your character, I really encourage you to do your research, make sure that you are kind of creating something that could exist in the real world, or if it's not something that could exist in the real world, you have a decent reason as to why. My older brother and my grandfather are actually both people who have experienced limb loss in their lives, so this is something that's very close to me, and I didn't have to do too much exterior research, but if I did not live alongside people with limb loss, if I hadn't spent that much time getting comfortable with those scars, I would definitely want to go into maybe some medical journals or maybe even just Google images if I'm feeling particularly brave, and look at references, make sure that I'm kind of following the anatomy of the body and the way that limbs are usually amputated. So for the king, you can see that his limb loss occurred above the bones of the wrist. It was his hand, but the bones of the wrist are still present, and if I zoom out at any point, you'll be able to see that there is a bump there, and that is the bone of the wrist still visible through his skin. And yes, this man washes his hair in the river, and yet it comes out looking just wonderful. Of the dateable characters, the king is actually the only one that has blue eyes. There wasn't a particular reason for that choice, but I did get to the end of my lineup and realized that for the most part, everybody else has either brown or hazel eyes. Obviously, Sagan, the Oracle, is an exception, but we'll get to them later. You can see that I am a big fan of using the airbrush settings on very low settings, kind of getting that gradient look down. In the real world, lighting is kind of subtle, and it can change on you in a second, and when you can't recreate lighting via like character sprites, you know, if you're moving to different locations, your character sprites are not necessarily going to have lighting changes. Creating those subtle color or value shifts will help compensate for some of that. Full disclosure, I started with the king because, one, I felt like as the father of the princess, and the princess being the main catalyst for a lot of the different plot threads in the game, I thought it was important that we do him first, but also he is just my fiance's favorite character, so I thought it would be kind of fun if I did her favorite first. So you can see I pause a lot as I'm working on this robe outfit. It's because I was getting her and checking on her opinions. Because she is sort of my focus group for this character. I have friends that are really big fans of each individual character, and when I am working on the character sprites, I will have those friends present. They're kind of, like I said, my focus group. They're my beta testers. They're going to give me their honest opinions on these characters that they want to date. So they're going to help me determine, you know, what makes this character attractive, what makes this character nice, all of those nice things. You can see here that even though I did the line art in a very dark brown that's not quite black, I do come back and most of the interior lines I change to be, you know, a little bit closer to the actual color of the fabric or his skin or his hair. This is just to help kind of prevent them from being harsh and distracting. It helps those lines sort of fade into the overall illustration without losing the sharp lines and edges that I wanted to have. Something to consider when you are making your character sprites is the entire story of your character, beginning to end, because you want to know how you're going to be using these sprites in your game. Are there specific things that you need? Say, is somebody going to be crying? You want to know that before you start so that you can illustrate those tears. Are they going to get into a fight at any point? Will their clothing become torn or come off of their bodies? These are things that we want to know before we get into the character design process, so we don't have to come back and draw more things later. Now, it's okay if you're working later and you find out, oh, actually, I do think I want this character to do X, Y, or Z, and you have to come back in and change up your character sprites. That's the purpose of having everything organized into folders like this, is that you can easily come in and change whatever it is that you want changed. But, as always, hindsight 2020, making a strong plan will allow you to prevent having to come back later. So I definitely think that you should have the endings determined and, frankly, as much of the in-between as you can. Because if you know everything that this character will be doing throughout the course of their story, it makes it a lot easier to know what kind of sprites you need. Now, originally this Mantle of War, which is an outfit that, with luck, you won't be seeing very often in the game, it was originally green. There's not really any historic relevance, but as I was working on it, it just didn't feel like the right color, so I dulled it down a lot, and I think that this is an improvement. I would encourage you, as you're working, to trust your eye more than your brain. It's kind of a weird concept, but basically if you have your reference images, and I will share a link, by the way, to the wonderful articles that I've been using for the most part for researching the costuming of this time. When you're looking at your reference images, you want to be trusting what you are seeing more than what you think should be there. It's kind of a hard concept to describe in a very effective way, but you know, when you look at something and maybe you see a sky that doesn't look blue, it looks more purple, it probably looks that way for a reason, and paying attention to those things can help you understand why. Now we are getting into the incredibly time-consuming and difficult process of actually saving each individual expression and outfit and hairstyle together as transparent PNG images. So you can see I removed the background, and I am now using the visibility of these different layers to hide and show the different elements that are changing for each sprite. I'm creating a kind of essentially a giant folder full of folders, and inside of each folder there is every possible combination of these different expressions and hairstyles and clothing. This way, when I go into code, I won't have to go into the actual Clip Studio file. I can just go into these folders and say, you know, oh, I know I'm gonna be in a scene where he is gonna be wearing this outfit with this hairstyle, and I need the expressions for this outfit with this hairstyle. I don't have to come back in here and individually find them. I know how to organize my folders, and I can find it in there. I will be sharing this document as well, the actual Clip Studio document, just so that you can open up the layers and get a sense for how I made this. I will not be doing this with the other ones just because it's kind of time consuming and, you know, they're big projects, but it will be there if you want it. So now we have a folder called The King Sprites, and inside of it you can see we have the different outfits and the different hairstyles. Some hairstyles and outfits will never be seen together. For example, the open robe outfit, he will never have his hair up, and I know this because I've already written a decent chunk of his route, but doing that just kind of lets me save a little bit of time. I don't have to save kind of redundant images, if you get what I mean. So by the time you're ready to move on, hopefully your folders should be well organized like this, have some kind of a shorthand naming convention. So for example, here we have a day off and his hair is in a loose braid, so DOLB, and then we have the name of the expression behind it. So, now that we know what we're in for, I'm going to be streaming the process of making the other character sprites here on YouTube starting in September, so you'll be able to follow along in real time. I promise I'm not going to keep you guys waiting for another year. The next character we're going to be working on is Faya, the Divine Artist, simply because he's the favorite of the people I've shown so far. But before we move on to the next step of the process, we are going to want to have all of our character sprites made. We want to have the good, bad, or neutral endings for each of your characters determined, and you're going to want to have Ren'Py downloaded and ready to go. That's it. See you guys next time.